the art for this first. The way that we prepare the art is a little bit different. So I made a couple very basic little drawings to add in for the title screen and the instructions here. So those are going to be my titles, and then I also added in this buttons thing. I haven't exported these yet because we're going to export them a little bit differently. You can normally we've been exporting things as sprite sheets, so all of the different states of the art are in one file, and that's really useful for animated sprites. The way that the UI system works, it's not as easy to use sprite sheets. You still can use sprite sheets, and I'll talk about that quickly. But it's not the most sort of intuitive that process. So what's a little bit easier is to export all of the frames on separate files. So that's what I'm going to go over, and we'll look at both ways of doing it. But I kind of prefer the way that I'll talk about, which is exporting each frame as a file. That workflow is a little bit easier. A couple of things that I'll mention about the art before we go over that. You'll probably notice that they're both grayscale, even though the rest of my game uses a lot of color. And there's an advantage to that, which is that you can modify the color of the artwork in Godot very easily. And so if you use a grayscale, it's easy to change the colors, and I'll show you guys how to do that. And that can be useful for UI, because you might want to have different colors in different scenarios. Of course, it's really easy to also just change the color of the original artwork. So it's not really necessary to do this, but this is just something that I want to go over in this example. It's also not just for UI. You can do this with any type of visuals in Godot, but I usually kind of do this this way. So you can use color, you can do it this way. It doesn't really matter either way, but I'm just going to go over that approach. Another thing real quick with these buttons. So for the button art, I made some just generic buttons, which are the first 3 buttons that you see here. And these I'm going to use for different button states. So when we just see the button, when we hover over the button, and then when we click the button, we'll have slightly different states, so we can see that the button is interactive. For the first 3 frames, I just have a generic button. So you can actually use text inside of Godot to make the button text if you want. You don't have to, have it written in. But if you write it in, so I did an example of a start button here, and if you write it in, of course, it's going to look a little bit more custom made. I forgot to fill in these guys here. It's going to look more like the rest of your design. So it's kind of up to you how to approach that, but there's a couple of different ways to do it. And I just wanted to demo creating another button in this style briefly, just to kind of go over how I would approach this before we export the art. So basically, with these buttons, they're all the same drawing that I've just copied a bunch of times, and I'm just adding different colors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this first one, and I'm going to drag it down to the bottom here. And you don't have to do this. You can have all your buttons look totally different, but if you want to just save a little bit of time on workflow, this is what I would normally do. So normally I would draw the text into the button first and then change the colors. That's going to save you a little bit of time, and you don't have to write the text a bunch of times. So I'm going to select the pen tool and select the color white. For this one, well, actually, it doesn't really matter. You can figure out how to do it. But I'm just going to make a quit button here. So I'm just going to write in quit. Okay, so now we have a little quit button. And then to get the different button states, I'm just going to duplicate this a couple times. And the way I set this up is basically a white border with a gray inside is sort of the main state, and then a white inside is sort of like the hover state, and then a black inside is the active state. Of course, you can do whatever you want here. You can have different colors represent different states, but it's good to stay consistent so that your user or your player, is familiar with what the different states mean. So we have our quit buttons. So the easiest one to do is just the one with the black background. So that's the third one. So I'm just going to hit 1 on the keyboard to select the black color from my palette, hit B to get my bucket and just fill that in. That's real quick. I'd probably use the paint all pixels. That'll save me a tiny little bit of time here. This one is a little bit trickier because I have a white background, or I want to make a white background, but I want to change the color of my text. And so what I can do is just paint all pixels and change this to black. And then I can change to white and fill in my inside, and then I can fill in, then I have to go back to regular bucket tool and fill the outside. So again, you know, these are just like things that I tend to do to speed up my workflow, especially if you have like tons of buttons or tons of art that you have to make that look the same. Simple little things like this will just save you a lot of time and add to the sort of consistency of the overall look of the game. Okay, so I'm going to save this, and I'm going to demonstrate a couple different ways to do this. So with my buttons, when I export, I'm going to click on the export, and instead of exporting a sprite sheet like I usually do for the art, what I'm going to do is export a zip. And the nice thing about the zip archive is that it will have each frame on a separate PNG file. And so then I can go in and place those into the different textures. And we'll see why this is a little bit easier with our textures when we're doing UI versus sprites for the main game art when we get into the editor. We have this option to add a prefix here, so I'm just going to call this UI underscore button underscore, and then download this zip. And so it goes to my game. I'm going to go to the sprites folders and just click save. And so this downloads a zip archive, and so before I can add this into Godot, I need to go over to my sprites folder and just unzip this archive. So there's that UI buttons folder. I can double click that. And now you can see I have a folder inside of my sprites folder that has all my UI buttons. The only problem here is that they're not labeled, so I don't know which one is start and which one is quit. That's not the end of the world. It's relatively easy to see them when we're adding them into the interface. Of course, you could rename them here if you want to. With my titles, I'm just going to export this as a sprite sheet just so I can demonstrate the other way that you might approach this. But if I was building this on my own, I would actually do the same thing here. I would download a folder of the zip files. So for this one, I'm going to export PNG, and I'm going to do a sprite sheet here. And this is just called UI titles. So I'll save this here. And I'll usually put UI at the beginning of all of the UI related art because it just makes it easier to find in my sprites folder. Now I have like my UI buttons folder and I have my UI titles here. So now I can delete this zip folder. I'm just gonna save these Piscal files, which are saved in my originals folder, and just get out of here. And so I can edit those later if I need to, but now I have the art that I need to start my start screen. So now I'll go over to Godot, and I'm gonna start my new scene. And again, this is like a new sort of paradigm that we haven't really worked with yet, so I'll try to describe the various things to look out for, but of course it's not going to be exhaustive. I'm just going to try to cover the main things. So to make this scene, I'm going to actually just close out my other scenes for now. And when we make a new user interface scene, you can see we're going to use this green user interface node. So I'm going to click on there, and that makes the default sort of user interface node is called a control node. And this has different properties than our sprites and other 2D game nodes because it doesn't exist in the moving game world with the camera. It doesn't change when our camera changes. So it's always going to be in the same place relative to the game window rather than moving around as we move our camera around in the world. So I'm going to rename this control node to start menu. And then we're going to start building it out. So the UI system in Godot takes a little bit of getting used to. But it's very node-based, the same way that our level editors are very node-based. And so what that means is nodes do specific things. So you might be used to doing stuff where if you've done like CSS or you've used like Illustrator or InDesign, things like that, to do layout and design in a sort of user interface way, you're used to like specific elements having like a width and a height and margins and all these different things. And that's not really how Godot works. In Godot, we have nodes that apply those things, and then we have content that goes inside of those nodes. So it takes a little bit of getting used to, but it's a pretty good system overall. And so I'll just go over a few basic things that I'll usually do when I'm creating a simple menu. So the first thing I want to do is just save this. So I'm going to save this into a scenes, and I'm going to make a new folder here called UI, just to separate this from my levels and my my components. And I'm going to call this scene start menu, so it's very clear what this is. And then I'm just going to start building this out. And once we have a few buttons and stuff, we'll attach the script and get that working as well. So one thing that's different in the UI editor that you won't see in the regular game editor is this green section over here. And this has some different properties that change how the UI relates to the game window. So one thing you'll definitely want to know is what the size of the game window is, whether it's resizable, whether it's full screen, because all that stuff will change the way that the UI works. But there's a few basic things that you can set here. So one is the anchor. And you can see that when I move this around, the little green arrows move around. And what those green arrows mean is basically how much the content will resize if the window size changes. And then the red dots represent where they're positioned on the screen. So we're not going to do anything crazy complex right now, so you probably won't have to worry about this too much. But that's kind of basically what those things do. And we'll see those things change as we add some different components to the menu. So one of the things that I'm going to do a lot of is add in little extra nodes. So with the start menu, before I even add in anything else, I'm going to add in a container. So there's a lot of different types of containers, and these containers kind of control the contents inside of them. And so you can see there's like a few basic different options that kind of match what you would expect from a simple layout. So there's horizontal containers that'll line things up horizontally. There's vertical containers. There's center containers. That means it's going to center all the content. I use a lot of those. There's a grid container, which is a little bit more complex. And then there's things where you can add margins, you can add scrolling. There's all sorts of different stuff. So one of the first things I'm always going to add is a center container. I'm just going to go ahead and start with that. And then I'm going to change the anchor preset to full. So it's going to take up the full window. And now I'm going to start to design my menu. And the way I'm going to set it up, you can set it up in lots of different ways. But the way I tend to set it up is using a horizontal box where you have art on one side and buttons on the other. Some people do this as a vertical box. You really can do whatever you want. There's also a lot of good like menu plugins. So if you don't want to build this on your own, you could probably use a good menu plugin, but then you'll have to learn their whole system. So I'm going to go ahead and add an HBox container. And so that'll organize my content horizontally. And so then in here, I'm going to have two sections. I'm going to have a graphic, and then I'm going to have buttons. So I'm going to add my graphic first. So I'm going to add a texture. And so you can see in our green UI nodes, there's different ways to add textures. So you can actually add sprites in here, but the sprites won't respond to the UI layout in the same way. So it's better to add a texture here. And this is where we're going to see why we don't necessarily want to use a sprite sheet. So I'm going to create a texture rect here. And I'm going to call this title. So this is my game title. And then I'm going to add a texture in here. But what we're going to see is we don't have a way to actually choose one of the sprites. So if I just go and load and go into my sprites and go into UI titles and open this up, you're going to see I have no way of telling it to only use the top or the bottom the way I would normally have with a regular sprite, where I can cut out the different parts of the sprite sheet. So the way I would have to do this instead is I'd have to use this thing called a atlas texture. And to use an atlas texture, it's really not that much more difficult, but we have to actually set the region. So for an atlas texture, I would load in my title texture, and then I would set the region. So the thing that I really have to set here is the width, which for this one is 512 pixels, and the height is 512 pixels. And there we go. Now we have just our title. So this is sort of like our sprite sheet, but we have to be more specific about which part of the sprite sheet we want. And then I could change, if I wanted the bottom of the sprite sheet, which I'll do later, I can add 512 to the Y, and that'll give me the second sprite. Of course, if I add like a random number here, it'll kind of be in the middle. That's not really what I want. So there's my game title. I didn't really spend very much time thinking about the name of the game, but that's okay. It's just a demo. So there's my title, and so now I need some buttons. And so next to my graphic, I'm gonna go to my H box, and I'm gonna add a V box here so I can organize my buttons vertically. Of course, all of these things you can change depending on the design you're going for. So I'm gonna do a V box container. And in here, I need a few buttons. So I'm gonna click on a button. I'm gonna add a texture button. So there's different types of buttons. And so you have some default buttons. You don't have to use your original art for a button. You can just throw a regular button in there and just type in some text and it'll work. But I like things to look like the rest of the design of the game. So I'm gonna use a texture button here and just click create. And I'm gonna call this my start button. And this actually has to match the code. I'm gonna double check it later. Actually, I'm not sure if it has to match the code. We'll have to look in a minute when we add our code in here. But now when we start to add content in here, you're gonna see the layout is gonna change a little bit. So for my start button, you can see I have different textures for different states. So there's normal, pressed, and hover. And so I can go in and add those graphics. So now you can see why here I would have to add in a texture atlas for each one of these things and then set the region. So it's a lot more steps than using a sprite sheet. Or it's a lot more steps than using like an animated sprite or whatever. So I'm just gonna load and go to my UI buttons, and there's my start button. And then I'm just gonna keep going through my start buttons for my various different states. And there's my last one. And so now I have my start button. It is very small, so I might want to make that larger, but I'm just going to stick with that for now. But notice a couple things about the layout. It's just kind of sticking up there. So here's where I mentioned we need a lot of nodes and a lot of containers. So what I want this to do is be centered. So I'm going to add another center container. So I'm going to go to my HBox container, add a center container, and then I'm going to drag my VBox into there. So now see how it's centered. So we need to, you might think, oh, that's a property I can set somewhere, but it's actually a node that we have to add into our node hierarchy, and then we have to kind of move stuff around. So we can run this now, and we'll see that the start button works, although it doesn't seem to do anything when I click on it. Maybe I put the wrong sprite in there. Oh yeah, I put the same sprite for pressed and hover. So let's change that real quick. That is my pressed. Okay, there we go. So now we can see that's interactive, and we can add a sound to that as well. So yeah, we might decide, actually, I don't want this to be I could like totally change this layout really easily. I could just say, you know what, actually I want this to be a V box, and I want this to be, so I'm just doing change type. I want this to be an H box. Now we have a totally different layout just by changing a couple nodes. So it is a pretty good system once you get used to it, but it's a little different than what you may have used in the past. So I'm just gonna undo that real quick. And let's add in our quit button. So for this one, I'm just gonna duplicate the start button. So I'm gonna hit Command D, and I'm gonna rename this quit button. And I'm gonna add in a couple textures. So I'm going to go to my textures and just reload these. And you can also drag and drop. You might save a little bit of time doing that. Okay, so I have my 3 quit buttons. And then the last one I'm going to do is a little bit different. I'm going to do a instructions button to go to the instructions page. But I didn't make this button, so I'm just going to go over how to add some text. So we have to be, we have to actually have the, if we want the nodes to be like hovering over each other, we have to give them a container. So I'll show you what I mean. If I duplicate my quit button and I make an instructions button, and I'm just going to change these textures to the default texture. So just the blank button texture. Okay, so that button works perfectly fine, but it doesn't say what it does. So we need a label for that. And so we can use a label, but the problem is if I just add a label right here, it'll be part of my VBox. And so if I say instructions here, it just looks like it's on its own. And if I want those things to be on top of each other, I need them to be in the same node. So what I can do is just add a node. So I'll just add a generic control node here, and I'll just put these guys in there. And so now they're going to be on top of each other. My instructions text is too big, so obviously I would want to change that, but for now I'm going to skip that just in the interest of time. You know, it at least describes what's going on, even though it looks kind of weird. So if we were using labels with our buttons, we basically need to add this extra level of you know, like this extra node to kind of combine them together in the same space. Okay, so we have our menu created. So let's connect our buttons to our script. This one, they all appear to work, so that's good. Oh, and then I didn't show, so if I want to, the other thing that's kind of nice about this is if I want to have like different colors or different designs in different areas, I can change everything together. So if I go like to this HBox container, this contains everything that's in here. If I go to visibility and modulate the color, it's going to do all the colors exactly the same. So that's kind of the nice thing about doing something in grayscale, is that they're all going to look the same. But I can also do that just on this VBox container. So I can go there, and then this will just affect my buttons. Or I can go to each button individually and change those there. So again, it's really not that hard to change the colors in the art and then do that later. But this gives me a little bit of flexibility if I have like different levels with different colors and stuff like that. So that's something I can do with anything in Godot, but it's particularly useful for UI, where we're kind of like repeating the same buttons and things over and over again. Okay, so let's connect our script and make this actually work. So I'm going to click on the start menu. I'm going to go to the script here. And I'm going to load. And there's a script for the menu, just menu. It's very simple. You may have to make some changes depending on what you want the menu to do. But we'll just set up some of the basics. So when we add the menu, you can see there's a couple of properties over here. One is the load level path. This is going to load whatever scene we want the start button to load. So we can just click on this and we can go to scenes. And if we want to load level 1, we can load level 1 or whatever level you want to load there. There's also an instructions level. We haven't created that yet, so we'll come back to that in a second. But that exists. And we're really just going to make a copy of this and use that. So now let's take a look at the script. We're going to connect our buttons to the different components in the script. So it's pretty straightforward. Essentially, we have like a couple paths for places that we might want to go. And then when we press the start button, it's going to load whatever we put there. When we press the instructions button, it's going to load whatever we put there. And then if we press the quit button, it's going to quit. There's also some stuff for sound if we want to add sound. I forget if I added UI to my sounds. I don't think I did, but maybe I will just put something in as an example. But we can reuse the same sounds for that. So let's just start with the button. So if I want to connect the button, if you name it correctly, it should just automatically connect here. But if you don't, you can still tell it to go to this function, or you can just rename this function. So to connect this, we just click on the start button, go to the node, and we use the pressed event. So we double click on that. We're going to connect it to the start menu, and then just go to on start button pressed, click OK, and click connect. So then if we click somewhere, we should see that green arrow, and that tells us that we got the right one. So let's go to the quit button, do the same thing. We just click on the pressed, find the quit button, and click connect. And for some reason, the green arrow only shows up after I do something else, but that's fine. And then the nice thing with our nodes is that they don't have to be all in the same place. We can still just add a signal here, make sure to use the right button or right function, and click connect. There we've got our instructions button. So let's see if this works, and then we can add a couple more things. So we should be able to start the game. Yep, that looks like it works. That's good. And we should also be able to quit the game. Okay, so now we have a quit button. That's great. And we'll be able to use that within the game as well. That's something that we'll cover next time, is putting a menu into the game as well. So then the instructions button, we don't have an instruction scene yet, but I'm going to make this really, really quickly. I'm going to go into my scenes folder. I'm going to go to my UI folder. My start menu, so my instructions scene is basically the exact same thing, except it has an instructions graphic and the same buttons and everything. So I don't really want to make it until I'm done making my start menu scene, because anything that I do after I duplicate it, I'm going to have to redo later. So for example, I want to connect these sounds. So let's actually do that before we duplicate it. So for our sounds, I really just want well, actually, I don't, now that I think about it, I don't know why I haven't thought about this before, but when you click the button down, most of the time you're just leaving the scene. So I'm not sure why I would even play a button. So let's just play the mouse entered one. I don't know, maybe it does play it. I don't know why I have that, but anyway, what we're gonna do is just click on the main node. Gonna add an audio stream player, just a regular one. And you can see what these need to be called inside the code. So I'm gonna call this hover sound. And I'm just gonna take out, so I'm just removing the comments to set these up. It's giving me an error. That's weird. Oh, I put a space in there by mistake. Okay. Okay, so now that is right, and now we can just connect the signals from all of our buttons to this on mouse entered. So I'm gonna go to start button, and this is mouse entered. So I'm gonna click on here and pick on mouse entered and connect. I'm going to do that with each button, because each button is going to play the same sound. Of course, if you want different sounds, then you can add more sounds. But I'm going to assume we want the same sound. And there's our instructions button. Okay. And I didn't make a sound for this, so I'm just going to throw a random sound in there. Maybe the enemy hit will be good, or maybe actually like the player land sound I think will be good, because it's kind of quiet. Player land, let's try that. Okay, so now when I run the scene, it should play a sound when I hover over the button. So that kind of reinforces to the player that this will do something if I click on it. Okay. So you can add the on button down, but I don't know if that's going to do anything. I guess it'll play the sound if it's like really fast. Anyway, let's skip that for now. Now, what I want to do is make my instruction scene and then connect it. So I'm going to go back to scenes. Now I'm going to click on my start menu and hit Command D. And I'm just going to call this instructions. And I'm going to double click to open this up. And literally the only thing I'm going to change in here is this graphic. So I don't even really have to change much. I do want to change the node title just so I don't get confused about where I am. If I can spell instructions correctly. It's kind of a long one. And then I'll change this also to instructions just so we know what's going on. But then in here, I can really just go to my texture atlas and move the Y value down, and we'll get those instructions. So we can see, that's sort of how you can do a sprite sheet style using the texture atlas. But you can also just export the images separately, and that's a little bit easier in my opinion. Either way is fine. And then, of course, since we're on the instructions page, we don't need an instructions button. So let's go ahead and just delete that node. And so now we just have a quit and a start button. And now, we're ready to go. So let's go back to our start menu. And let's add the path to our instructions here. So I'm going to go to Scenes, UI, Instructions, and save that. And now I should be able to go into Instructions. And now I can quit, or I can start. And so now I have a little title, I have some instructions, and I have a quit button. And we'll use those same ones later to make like a game over menu, and maybe like a menu if you win the game or if you win a level. But you can really use UI for lots of different stuff. I'm using it for a menu as an example, but if you have like narrative scenes that you want that don't have gameplay in them, that just have like some drawings or, characters or whatever that tell a story, you can have just a series of UI scenes that will just have like an image, and you could click through, you could have buttons, or you could even just like click on the image to go to the next scene. So there's a lot of stuff you can do with UI. We'll do a little bit more with it next week, but that's just kind of getting started. Okay.